You know, society's got no hold on this outlaw.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time. This is a video that is my second 2024 video on banned books. That's part of a project that's been initiated by MJ at Reading This Life, and it's about highlighting and celebrating books that have been challenged or banned. Okay, so there are different levels. So some may have been challenged in a couple of schools, some may have been outright banned, some may have been banned for decades, some may have been banned in several different countries. The point is there's a whole gamut of different kinds of censorship and issues with the availability of certain kinds of literature, and that's what we're looking at in this project. And today's video is about A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. So this book is extremely complex. This is going to be a much more nuanced video than the previous one I did on The Wizard of Oz, which is a light fluffy tale about a girl on an adventure where she meets some fantastical people and wants to go home. This is far more complicated. It's far more challenging. It's far more provocative, really provocative, and it would initiate a much more complicated debate. So, this was a book that was written in 1962 by Anthony Burgess, who's an English writer, who's lived in different places and had quite an interesting kind of life experience, and he can speak many languages as well. He can speak Malay, Chinese, Russian, Hebrew and Japanese, and he was a bit of a scholar in English as well, so he taught English. And I've seen him on TV interviews speaking in great depth and detail about the development of the English language over the centuries. So he was a real expert on language. And I think that is really interesting, because the most striking thing in this book, the most demonstrably characteristic thing in the book, is the language. So the language is nicknamed Nadsat. So this is a name that he's made up himself for this slang that's used in the book. And the book has this language that's like a cross between Russian and Cockney. So if you're not familiar with Cockney, the Cockneys are a particular kind of Londoner that live in the East End of London, and they have this slang that they use, and it's like a very culturally significant part of London. So this slang that he created for this book is a mixture of Russian and this Cockney. And that language pervades through the whole thing. And it's going to dominate the review as well that I'm making here, because it really does change the experience of the book as a reader. But I'll get there in a minute. So what I'm going to do, like I did in the previous video, I'm going to talk about what the book's about, and I'm going to talk about why it was banned, and then I'm going to tell you my opinions about it, and how I feel about the book. So, as I said, he wrote this in 1962, and he was aware of the violence that was happening in the streets with the young people in the early 60s. And quite infamously, you had the fights between the mods and the rockers at the time. So these were literally rock and roll fans in the streets, having really, really violent gang fights with mods who were basically people, teenagers who had a different music taste. But it became a real cultural thing with these social tribes being created that created this violence. And they used to regularly go to Brighton, and you'd have these really serious clashes with weapons and knuckle dusters, and people were hospitalized. It was a real thing, and it's something that's been analysed to death in sociology classes, and we look at it in my music classes as well, actually. So the Modern Rockers was definitely something that he was aware of and thinking about, because I've actually seen him in an interview reference that when someone asked him about the violence in this book. He was thinking about that when he was depicting this near future where the police have been reduced to hardly anything, and there's kind of this anarchistic bedlam going on in the streets, and you've got these gangs roaming the place. And it centers on one particular gang, which is led by this guy called Alex. And his gang is called the Droogs. And that's Georgie, Pete, and Dim, and Alex. It's really interesting that Dim is one of the names, because he becomes really important in the plot later on. And all the way through the book, Alex is basically taking the piss out of him for being dim. And because it's a first person book, so it's all from Alex's perspective. And then whenever he refers to Dim, he talks about how stupid he is. And I think that is definitely part of the reason why the plot develops like it does between Dim and Alex. So I won't spoil it, but yeah, he's very disdaining and negative about Dim through the whole book. So the streets have become this sort of full of this violent activity, and the Droogs are the centre of the book, and they're going around basically just for fun, just for the kick of it, just randomly beating people up, raping women, vandalizing stuff. There's a lot of vandalism in the book, vandalizing the interior of houses as well as the streets as well. And they start off, and they occasionally go back to the milk bar. And the milk bar is an interesting concept, because it's a social place that's very popular, and they go there, and clearly these are actually they are they're very young. So that's one thing that you don't take in the same way. Once you're reading it, it's easy to forget it, but they are very young. Alex is only 15, and it could be a reference to how young they are, that they're not drinking alcohol in these milk bars, but the milk bars are serving milk. So as you would be familiar with milk, but with narcotics put in the milk, so they're kind of spiked milk, if you like. So it's not just milk, but it's not alcoholic milk. There's some, they put other drugs in it. So yeah, it's an interesting concept. Again, you've got this sort of otherworldly sort of not really dystopia necessarily, but certainly a broken down society. I don't know that I don't know if I could call it dystopia. I think sometimes it's described as a dystopia, but I'm not sure, because it's more of the opposite of state control rather than the input of state control. It seems like the control has been broken down, although that does come into force in the latter half of the book. So anyway, it is often called a dystopia. So they're going around doing these things and creating all this violence, and basically through this is going to feature spoilers. I should say this when I do these videos. I should say there's spoilers, because I don't think you can talk about this without spoilers. So apologies if I've already spoiled some of this. But through these several acts at the beginning of the book, it leads to another act where they break into a house, and Alex kills an elderly lady, and this is the point where he gets caught. And I won't say how he gets caught, because that's too much of a spoiler, but he gets caught, and he gets put in prison for 14 years. While he's in prison, he carries on with this violence, and there are incidents in prison as well. But he volunteers to take part in some experimental therapy called the Ludovico technique, which is basically where his eyes are forced open, like forced to be kept open, and he is objected to constant images of violence and sexual violence and pain and, you know, blah, 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 that kind of thing. Like, and like these distressing images are thrown at him while he's forced to watch them through this technique. And basically through this aversion therapy, basically, he then kind of gets better. And one of the interesting things as well about the ending of the book is that he does become a different person. And the American version of the book, when they published it in America, they felt like the very end of the book, which again I won't spoil, but the very end of the book was too unrealistic, so they lobbed off the last chapter and just left it as had a different ending, which I think is really interesting. But anyway, that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's most of the book. And throughout this book, Alex refers to the violence they do as doing the ultra violent. Like, he uses the phrase doing the ultra violent. And that idea of this violence, the ultra violence, is violence without cause, violence for the sake of violence. And this is like basically what the book is mostly commenting on. And I would suggest, although the reason why I think this is such a controversial book is that you could get various different messages from it, but I think the point of the book is that, referring to the title, Clockwork Orange, is the fact that even though it's violence for violence sake, and Anthony Burgess was worried about the amount of violence in society at the time and amongst the youth, he regards the involvement or over-involvement of the state as more worrying and more of a threat to democracy and freedom. And he's choosing Alex to be the example he's using of this idea of it would be cruel and wrong and immoral to brainwash the population into being effectively a clockwork orange. So whereas an orange is an organic thing that would be sort of living freely, a clockwork orange would just be dead inside. That's the idea. That's the idea of the title. And that point of the book is, I think it's quite clear, but I can imagine you could probably get the opposite as well. And certainly there is sometimes the feeling, I'd say for a lot of it, that it celebrates and arguably glorifies what the Droogs are doing, because there's a sense of excitement in the text, because it's first person and because of the nature of the action in the book. So there's so much of it is just the violence. And if you were then to add that to the idea that the government are being criticised within the book's subtext, then again that's also reinforcing the idea that the youths in the book are somehow exonerated. So yeah, it's a very complicated message. It's a very complicated picture that's in the book, and it's a very complicated text. Going back to the first thing I talked about, which is the language, the slang, nadsat, I think the effect of that is really interesting, because it effectively creates an alienation effect. That means that for me, reading the book was definitely an intellectual exercise. This was not speaking to my heart, it was speaking to my brain, and my brain was shifting through the information and going through this journey rather than feeling the journey through emotions. And I don't know, I don't think that was the reason why he created that slang. He has been on record as saying that the reason why he created the slang was because he thought that if he used actual real slang from the late 50s, early 60s, then he thought the book would date quicker. So he didn't want the book to date, he wanted it to last longer. So that's why he chose to create his own slang, which is very clever. But I think it created another effect, and that was this alienation effect, where you are removed from the action and you're removed from the text. And it's the kind of thing that Brecht talked about. So I've mentioned Brecht before on my videos. I did a video about theatre that, if you're curious, check it out. But I did talk about Brecht quite a lot because I think he's a really interesting, fascinating writer, playwright, and practitioner in theatre. And he talked about epic theatre and how he wanted to reinforce to the audience that it was a theatrical experience they were seeing and not real life. And they didn't want them to take in the contents of the play through their heart. He wanted them to think about it, and he wanted them to be actively engaged in the play through the Brechtian techniques he put on stage. And like breaking the fourth wall, for example, that was a way of him making it an intellectual exercise rather than an emotional exercise. And I think that's what the slang does in this. And it means that you are you're an observer, and you're removed from it, and you're not, even though you are just getting his perspective, you're only getting Alex's perspective. So there is the potential and the danger of just being led through this journey, through this violence, and what happens to Alex in prison as an emotional experience. But I don't think it is an emotional experience because of the slang and the language that he uses, and I think that's really interesting, because that means you can then think about, well, what's this book trying to say? And is it a positive message? Is it, do you agree with the message? Whatever, that kind of thing. And I do think it's a really complex message. It's a very nuanced message. And I don't think that it's quite an extreme book, but I don't think it's a really obvious point. I think you can probably get various points, and you can, and people on different sides of the political spectrum could justify what they're saying from elements of the book. So I do think that's interesting. So yeah, as a reader, I found it quite alienating and quite distancing, and I found that that allowed me to think about the meaning of the book, and I think it's a really interesting, fascinating book. So why was it banned? So it was banned several times, which I think is really interesting. I've got some dates here on a bit of paper. It was banned in 1973. It was banned in 1976. It was banned in 1977. It was banned in 1982, all in various parts of America. And even as recently as 2019, there was an attempt to ban it as part of a whole wave of stuff that this particular authority was trying to ban in 2019. So these are different parts of America. So several attempts, well, several times when it was actually banned, plus this attempt in 2019. And a lot of it was because of the sexual violence, and just the tone of the book is very anarchistic. So it's not really that surprising that it's controversial and seen as problematic. But I don't think it's an obvious example where it's obviously glorifying violence. I think there is a sense that I think it could be argued it does, but I don't think it's that obvious, in the sense that I think you could easily argue that it doesn't. When I think about violence like this in different media, so if I think about films, I'm going to talk about the film of the book in a second as well. But when I think about films that have this kind of content, I think about a film like the Australian film Romper Stomper. I think Romper Stomper is a lot less moral than this. So I think Romper Stomper deliberately follows this gang that are beating up ethnic minorities, and the camera doesn't seem to have an opinion. The camera is just following them, but because of the nature of what they're doing and the way they're doing it, the camera actually does insert this kind of adrenaline, and this excitement with what they're doing. And I think you could argue that what Rhombus Stomper's doing is glorifying it. But I don't think that's true for this. I think that this has this distancing effect with the slang. So even though I really don't think it was Burgess's intention, there is actually what's happened, that there's this alienation effect from the slang. And it's a really interesting thing to read, because I remember trying to read this years ago, and I got through about a couple of pages of just getting on my nerves because of the intensity of the slang. There was so many words that were made up that I was just like, nah. But because I really wanted to read it this time for the project, I got through a few pages in a different way. So I read it in a different way. I just kept reading. And the words are consistent, even though they're made up, they're consistent. And you get into the flow of it, and it becomes less alien as you read it. And I think that's really interesting as well. So the experience of reading the slang gets easier as you read it. So if you do start reading this and the language gets on your nerves, then it does definitely become much easier to read, and it doesn't become such a hassle. So that could be an important bit of information for you if you are reading it. But anyway, it was banned for the content, the violence and the sexual violence. And I think if you didn't have that in there, obviously you wouldn't be making this point. And I think it's a really interesting political book, and it does create an interesting debate about what do you do with juvenile delinquents? What do you do to solve the sort of gang warfare and the apparent nihilism of youth gang behavior? How do you deal with custodial sentences? Is there such a thing as rehabilitation? Is it immoral to have the Ludovico technique with the aversion therapy kind of thing? There's so many questions that could be an interesting source of debate, that it seems to miss the point to just say, oh, it's violent, let's get rid of it. Don't put it on the shelves because it's violent. That's the whole point. Clearly this is not intended for kids, like The Wizard of Oz was. But it's an important book, I think. And it's a really interesting book. It's a book that's difficult to read, but again, once you get into the rhythm and the flow of it, it becomes a lot easier to read. He seems like an interesting man as well, because while I was trying to find out what he thought about the book, I ended up seeing lots of interviews with him talking about other things as well. And yeah, he's an interesting person to look at in the interview situation in the 70s. He was on Dick Cavett a lot and all that sort of stuff. I do find that sort of thing interesting. But yeah, Anthony Burgess, A Clockwork Orange, a book I've read for 24 for 24. Definitely should not have been banned, and there shouldn't be an attempt in 2019 to ban it. It's definitely worth reading. It's very complex, and it offers up lots of debate about violence, the treatment of the people that get caught after they've been violent, and how we deal with our justice system and our and crime and punishment in general. It's a very good source of debate for that. So there we are, Clockwork Orange. Let me know what you think of the book. And oh yeah, I hadn't mentioned the film, sorry. Well, the other, like, a little PS, postscript moment, because I did really want to talk about the book, but one of the interesting things about the film is it's a rare moment where Stanley Kubrick, who directed the film, banned his own film. So there were copycat killings or incidents after the film was released, and he was quite upset by that and banned the film himself. I mean, ironically, as soon as he died, the production company released the film on DVD or released it to cinemas, I think. But anyway, Kubrick banned it himself, and I think that's really quite interesting, because I don't think that happens very often at all. But the book definitely deserves its status, deserves to be read, and it's got a lot of things to say about society, and even if it's not saying it, it's got a lot of debates to conjure up about society, because I do think that, you know, what it's saying needs to be discussed. And as I said, I think the NADSAT, the slang technique, helps a healthy debate, I think, because you're reading it from here, really, rather than from there. That was my experience. Okay, so let me know what you think of the book. Thanks a lot for watching. Stay curious, everyone.
Paint me a picture of what it's like to be